folks. Welcome to the GreenCourt Connections podcast. I'm your host, Jay Bland, Chief Growth Officer here at GreenCourt. GreenCourt Connections exists to help connect our listeners on a deeper level with the hardworking folks that work in and interact with government agencies and court systems. I'm very excited about this episode today. Our guest is a trailblazer. She's absolutely fearless, and we've just recently gotten to know each other while serving together on the NCIA board. And I've been so impressed with her leadership and really intrigued by her perspective. So please join me in welcoming Shaneen Moore, the Deputy Assistant Commissioner and Director of the Child Support Division within the Children and Family Services Administration of Minnesota, DHS. Shaneen, thank you so much for being with us today. Am I allowed to call you doctor yet?
Almost. You got about a month and 8 days.
You've got your paper due, right?
Well, I got a paper due, but I'll be finishing my research over the summer. But I will be graduating in May. So I'm close enough to graduate. Let's just say that.
Well, next time we get together, I can call you doctor. How about that?
Yes. Yeah. So when you see me in August at the NCIA board meeting, I'll be Dr. Moore officially. But no, thanks for having me this morning. It was an honor to be asked. So as you mentioned, Jay, I'm Shaneen Moore. I'm one of the Deputy Assistant Commissioners within the Children and Family Services Administration at the Department of Human Services in Minnesota. I'm also the Child Support Director for the state. I've been in my role 10 plus years now. I've been in my Deputy Assistant Commissioner role 3 years. And I think about, the work that we've been able to accomplish, myself and my counterparts over these last 3 years. It's like lightning speed, but we're getting ready to move into a new state agency known as the Department of Children, Youth, and Families in 89 days. I remember about this time last year when we were just having these conversations and we were like, okay, is the legislature going to pass the bill to make sure that this happens? And from there, once it passed, we were ready, set, go. So it's been a really phenomenal, I'll say, last year in public service in the state of Minnesota, given the legislative priorities we've had and the ability to do some really awesome work.
So as part of the new agency, will y'all change the titles? Government titles are a mouthful. Y'all going to streamline those titles?
We'll be Department of Children, Youth, and Families. So that's still kind of a mouthful. So, we're still working out the organizational structure, but tentatively, child support and our TANF program will become one administration known as the Family Wellbeing Administration. So that's a little shorter, right?
That's a little shorter.
That will suffice, right? So
now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think you are the first African American to be the child support director in Minnesota. Is that right?
That is correct. I came to state service in 2013 as the Deputy Assistant Commissioner, someone who, at that time, we didn't have a very diverse leadership team. And in our division at the state level, period. And so as I got to know the staff and the folks, it was really important at that time, when I became director, that I really wanted to be intentional in diversifying not just race and ethnicity in our department, but, all aspects of diversity. And so I made it very clear to my leadership team that we were going to focus on equity, that we were going to be intention in our purpose in serving families. And we're going to use data to inform our policy decisions. And so I haven't strayed away from that mission, and it has served us well. I would say that our administration as a whole, we are a leader in that space within our current agency. And so my hope is that once we move into our new home, Department of Children, Youth, and Families, that ability to continue to do this phenomenal work will only grow because the focus will just be on children, youth, and families in our new state agency. Right. So that will only give us more leverage to be able to do things that maybe we wouldn't be able to do within a larger agency.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of mentioned focus there, and we see this on the private side a lot. There are too many companies that are trying to do too many things at once. And the ability to streamline your efforts and focus your efforts on a smaller target only increases the chances of being successful.
Absolutely. One of the missions that we have and some of the work that I'm leading as we transition is really around the focus of whole families. And what does that mean? Minnesota has been a leader in that space for, I'd say, the last 7 or 8 years on a national perspective. But to bring that lens to an entire state agency, so we have this vision, mission around whole family systems and the work that we want to see at the new state agency. So we're developing guiding principles and practices, and we have this beautiful graphic that we've developed that we hope to reveal soon. But really just saying, we can no longer see families from individual perspective, like from siloed programs, and just saying, they come to us as whole families and whole beings. And so we have to honor that and be more intentional on how we work collectively together.
Yeah, it's definitely, the way we're viewing child support as part of the greater framework of the social safety net is definitely changing. I mean, we've seen it with name changes in organizations, and we've seen it with more than just name changes. We've seen people actually change how they approach enforcement. And I look forward to getting into some of that with you today.
Yes.
But let's back up for a little more of a softball.
Okay.
I've been to Minnesota before, and I was amazed that the buildings in Minneapolis were connected with tunnels, which showed me that it's way too cold there. If they say, hey, you don't need to go outside, you need to walk through this tunnel, that tells me all I need to know. But if someone were to visit Minnesota for the very first time, what's something they should go see or do?
Well, first of all, to your point, don't come here in the winter. I have lived here 26 years, and I still, when we have very cold winters, it's still a real struggle. But I mean, like, when you want to think of, and I know you live in the South, so you all don't get the full seasons like we do up here in the North. But Minnesota is one of those places. So like on our license plate, it says land of 10,000 lakes. That is literally a true fact. So if you are someone who loves the outdoors and fishing and hiking and all of those sorts of things, this is the place to come when the weather's warm. We have the most beautiful summers here. So everyone was like, well, it doesn't get, so we have humid days on occasion. That's, global warming. But we don't have it to the extent that you would say you would have in Georgia. And so I would say the hiking, the fishing, the outdoor activities. And then in the winter, folks like to still go outside and do cross countries. I don't do it. I tried it a few times, but like cross country skiing and what's that, snow with the snowshoes, and you walk and hike. And we have beautiful trails. Now I've walked the trails in the winter, but some of those fun activities. And there's a lot of kids that like to go, and I know you have kids, like to go snowboarding. There are places here that you can do all that fun stuff. So maybe you need to come visit in the winter.
I'd love to. And I live here in Atlanta, and we're all Falcons fans because we have to be, not really because we want to be. And we just took one of Minnesota's own in Kirk Cousins.
You did. Thank you for doing that.
That's not what I wanted to hear. We're excited about him.
Yeah. Well, maybe he will give you all a better, because I'm a Vikings fan, of course. maybe he will give you a better run that he gave us, because it was so unpredictable. As the years went by, he got more, his probability of success increased, but it was so unpredictable. So maybe the warmer weather will give him better opportunity there in Atlanta.
Maybe so. We'll see. But we're excited to have a quarterback here in Atlanta. We're talking about quarterbacks. Your dream job as a kid was probably not to be a quarterback, but what was your dream job when you were a kid?
Yeah, I had several, so it kind of changed with the weather. I've always been someone that cared about people. So at one point in time, I was very much into being or wanting to be in the medical field, so nursing or a doctor. And then I've always been business minded and savvy. So I always knew eventually I would probably go into business. And then I have these hobbies that I like to do. So, like sewing and fashion and interior design was also something I was passionate about coming up. And so I said, if I ever hit the lottery and could retire, I would probably travel the world, because that's now my new found hobby, traveling the world while doing some sort of fashion or interior design sort of work. I have this, I like architecture and visual design sorts of things. So yeah, but I started out, wanting to help people, and here I am helping people.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to be a doctor soon, but
Yes, right?
like a medical doctor, you are involved in helping families,
Yeah.
and so I think there's an application there for sure. Um, I've mentioned this multiple times, but I wanted to be a trash truck driver when I was a kid, because it looks so cool, like those guys
Right?
hanging off the truck, which is not something we're allowed to do as kids. So maybe that was part of it. My father is a medical doctor. He's a radiation oncologist, and my sister is a nurse practitioner. So I've been around the medical field a lot. But I tell you what, growing up with a father who is a physician treating terminal illnesses like cancer, that's not something I wanted to do.
Yeah.
So it definitely turned me off of that.
Yeah.
Um, we're going to talk a lot today about mentorship, because I think it's so important. But who have been some very impactful mentors for you in your professional life?
Yeah. So, coming to Minnesota in the late 90s, early 2000s, one of my first jobs. So, I don't know if you know this about me, Jay, but my background is finance accounting. I have an MBA. So when I first moved to Minnesota, that was about the time that Wells Fargo was transitioning, and they Norwest and Wells Fargo bought Norwest, which is a local bank here. And so we were in the middle of that acquisition. So I was working in corporate Wells Fargo at the time, helping with some of that transition and acquisition work. And then I went after Wells Fargo, to the Federal Reserve of Minneapolis, where I was a senior financial analyst for a few years. And so during that time at the Fed, um, I had a mentor, and that was probably the first time that I really could see myself in a leadership or managerial position.
Mm.
And so, she was a woman of color. And she was smart as all get up. And she had the opportunity. She had worked in several feds, and she landed in the Fed here in Minneapolis. And so she was like, I see the potential and your leadership capability. I was like, wow, really? So she took me under her wing, and she mentored me. I believe it was like a year and a half or 2 years. And then she moved to another Federal Reserve. We have not talked in years, and I would love to be able to find her. I think she's in Washington, D.C.'s last I knew. But just having folks that believe in your skills and your abilities and seeing things in you that you may not see in yourself are important. And so from there, then I moved into other corporate positions outside of the Fed, because at that time, the Federal Reserve is one of those places and jobs. It's, now that I think about it, it's like it was the perfect storm. Even back in the early 2000s, like they had all these perks and well-being programs for staff. Like people never left, right? So they wanted me to be in a managerial position, but the person that I was hoping to replace had already been there like 35, 6, 7 years. She had no plans in the immediate future to retire. So I said, okay, let me go and get some additional experience. But eventually I landed in a nonprofit organization and did some operational managerial work. And that's where I regained my passion for really wanting to be front and center with families. And so the opportunity for the state of Minnesota's deputy director in child support came up. And so people were like, well, how did that, that wasn't your background. I had worked at the county level previous to nonprofit work in the juvenile justice space. But when I interviewed, I told folks, I'm like, by that time, I was a single parent. I had 2 young kids, 2 young sons, and they're like, why do you want this job? And I said, I have 20 plus years of personal lived experience with child support. I think I can tell you a little bit about it from that perspective and bring that to the work. And so the assistant commissioner at the time, she took a chance on that, and she was like, we want you here. So come on aboard. So I did that, and I've been here ever since, and I have enjoyed the work that we've done together.
Yeah, you mentioned early on your mentor planted a seed in you that you could be a manager, right? And I think that's so important. It's something I try to do every day. When it's real and when it's authentic, you want to be authentic about it. But if you can just plant that seed in people that you see a bright future in leading people, that can be the catalyst to really push them into that world and help them believe in themselves. So it sounds like that was a big moment for you.
It was, and I never looked back after that. And so you're out, yeah, absolutely. It changed my perspective, in around the work around being a manager and being someone in leadership and positional leadership. And so to that point, I too also believe in supporting and uplifting young folk that are coming behind me. So giving them the same words of encouragement around, taking a chance and believing in yourself and not letting someone tell you things that they think you can't do when you know in your heart you can do. And so I try to mentor very young children to older children to young adults. Yeah.
You talked about your finance background. When you really peel back the curtain and look at child support, there's a huge finance piece of it. I mean, some of those formulas will blow your mind and how detailed they are. But did you find that your finance background gave you a nice head start in the child support world?
I would say to some perspective, like, I was someone who's always good at math. So I was, believe it or not, when I was in high school, a lot of my teachers, so I was the kid that was taking physics and chemistry. Like I was supposed to probably have been an engineer because I was just that good at math. I was passionate about trigonometry and, all the statistics that you can think of. I was really good at math. So so from the financial perspective, I get how these systems work from that perspective. I think through my doctorate education, so my doctorate is in public service and management. that brought the policy perspective to the work. So I really had the opportunity. So it took me 7 years of going to school one night a week after working all day on a Wednesday night, usually from 6:30 to 9:30. I would sit in a classroom. And really, the last 7 years, really hone in on understanding public policy and systems and data analysis and just social policy and all of those things. So having the combination of the financial statistical background with the public policy degree now that I will have as a part of my doctorate work, I think has made me a very well-rounded person in the space of child support and public service. And so I can bring the best of two worlds together.
Yeah, well said. Well, I think you've spent a few years now inside of the program, and you've seen some of the changes that have been made at the federal level and local level. What are some changes you want to see in the program over the next 10 years?
Oh, that's a good one. In the next 10 years, my hope is that we can truly get at understanding. In my opinion, we have a mix match of what we're saying, what we're about versus what we still hold on to, right, from the past. So, we're talking about serving whole families, and it's not, just parents or mothers or just fathers or, how parents choose to identify. It's serving those individuals and their need, right? Recognizing potential barriers and being able to pay their support. But at the same time, we still have, whether it's enforcement practices, whether it's our performance measures, whether it's the concepts around welfare recovery, like those are still things that traditionally have hinged our program on the onset, but those things don't match what we're saying we're about today when we're serving families. So my hope is that over the next 10 years, that we can start to maybe do a child support reboot 5.0. I'm like, I don't know what version we are on about, because we've changed law over the course of the years. But really get at the realization that families don't look the way that they looked 40 or 50 years ago when this program came into existence. And we have to do a better job at, performance measures can't be, we've got to change the concepts around performance measures and what are we really truly intending to measure.
Yeah.
And recognizing that some of the mindset around social policy and practice that centered around some of these enforcement practices don't really, when you think about it, like truly think about it, and I do often, taking away someone's driver's license, it might get you a reaction, but in today's society, a lot of people need to be able to drive. And if that means taking that license away and that person can't participate with that child, they can't be instrumental in helping, say, an elderly parent or grandparent get to the store or the drive, like that is not serving that to me is not serving the whole family. And so we need to be cognizant of that and figuring out how to better get at some of the results that we want to see without causing intentional harm.
Yeah, I think I love your perspective on it. I don't think you and I agree on everything, and I think that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked about it on this podcast a lot. I wish people would learn how to disagree in a respectful way again, because we've lost that.
Yeah.
Absolutely lost that. People only surround themselves with people that think the same way they do, and I think that's just a horrible way to go about life. But I agree with you that families today don't look like they did 50 years ago. right? And you've got laws that were written based on the way families looked 50 years ago. One of my fears is that we go too far, which I don't think we're even close to going too far yet. But
No.
but I think one of my fears is that we go too far away from enforcement and forget what the purpose of the program was or maybe is. But like you said, we've got a long way to go before we get there.
Yeah. So let me give you an example to why this has helped still. And so please know, I was fortunate to be in one. So I have two cases. My case was one, I had one of my children's father it was never an issue. It was clockwork.
Right.
The other one was not.
Right.
So I understand the importance of enforcement. But looking back to this day, I don't know, like knowing what I know, I still don't think even the me today would say I would still be diligent about some of the enforcement given what I know about what was happening in his life.
Yep.
So in Minnesota, one of the things that we were able to really dig into around driver's license suspension, again, remember I mentioned data and the use of data. We had someone pre-pandemic on my team that's no longer at the state office, but helped run our help desk, supervisor. And she was getting all of these calls around driver's license suspension and the harm it was causing families.
Mm-hmm.
And so we decided at that point to pull some data out of our system. Let's take a hard look at what driver's license was doing and who it was impacting, and do some analysis. So my data and research team at that time pulled some data, and what we discovered very quickly is that here in the state of Minnesota, and I suspect probably nationwide, that Black, Brown, Indigenous folk were more likely to experience at least one incidence of driver's license suspension. And those were also folk that earned $10,000 or less. So those weren't individuals that didn't want to pay their support. They
Right.
didn't have the means to pay.
Right.
So we were consistently causing harm. And this is a true story. And I'll go back to that, but this is a true story that is leading into some of this. So day 2 as director, state director, I had my help desk folks. There's a gentleman that would just consistently call because his driver's license, he just couldn't understand why it was being suspended and the problems with the suspension. This person was trying to get his license back because he was by trade a truck driver. He had the care of his 2 young children. However, he lost his job, meant he lost his housing, which meant him and his 2 kids were living in his car. And this particular county refused to help him address that situation. So every time he would call, staff were like, oh my God, he's calling again. We're not, we got to the point they didn't want to pick up the calls and it was letters instead of calls. So that particular day he called and I said, well, patch him in. I'll talk to him. So, he started out with the cursing and the yelling. I'm like, wait a minute. Okay, let's pause. I want to understand what's happening here. And so he's like, okay. So we talked it through. And I said, let me make a few phone calls to the county and some folks in community for advocacy for you. And give me about 3 days and I'm going to have a solution and answer for you. And I will call you back. And he was like, no, you're not going to call me back. I said, I'm going to call you back. So I contacted the county and we dug into the case and tried to figure out, what can we do to resolve this? And, it was a repeat, situation where he would get it and then it'd be suspended and then the payment arrangement wouldn't be met and then it'd be suspended again. So I know several folks through my networks um, in the legal space, and I know a few pro se folks, and I said, hey, one of the largest law firms in the city, I know who runs their legal clinic. I need some support over here for someone who has this driver's license suspension issue and it's causing harm to the children because he can't work. He's a truck driver. These children are homeless and they're living in a car with their dad. And so my colleague and friend stepped in and said, hey, I have connections in that part of the state. We'll make some calls to our advocacy center up there. They did. They helped him legally get the issue resolved. He got his license reinstated. I called him back and I said, hey, we got to figure it out. We're getting this. You're getting your license back. We're working through it and you're going to be good. And he was like, no one has ever taken the time to do that for me and to understand my barriers, right? So doing this driver's license suspension project, so years fast forward, that was in 2018. Years fast forward, there are other families that are experiencing those same barriers. We were able to identify those families, and we participated in a procedural justice project during the pandemic, where we had 12 counties across the state in various regions that helped us pilot this project and really get at some of the subjectivity that things like driver's license
Right.
has, right? And some of those folks are in counties that were like, no, that's the only way I can get people to cooperate and pay. But looking at the data, those efforts were in many times not producing any results. So we got those folks on board. We did some training around implicit bias and cultural competency for folks to understand what subjectivity, what it looks like. And those folks were like, oh yeah, you're right. We do have, even though we don't intentionally sometimes recognize it, it exists. And so those folks became some of the biggest advocates. They took some of that training and even though it was a subset of their staff, they rolled it out to their entire teams, right? And we did an initial evaluation on the work. And indeed, people are treated differently based upon sometimes race. In this case, what we saw was that sometimes folks that had English as a second language were the ones that weren't getting the opportunity to have those things like a payment arrangement. It was automatically click the button and you're getting your suspended license, and there wasn't a callback or a second chance, right? And so we're going to do some additional evaluation on that process and that project, but digging into it, on the surface, it doesn't seem as if there are any concerns or differences. Digging into the data and hearing the stories, that's where you see it. And that's where you're like, okay, there are opportunities here. And because of that, we were able to change at a state level what we are doing with our driver's license suspension policy and being more flexible and recognizing the subjectivity and creating opportunity so that everyone is receiving equitable treatment.
That's a great story. And a few things stick out to me. First of all, a lot of people that don't trust government, they usually don't trust them because of past experience, right?
Yes.
And immediately you asking questions and trying to understand shifted that father's mindset a lot, right? You were
Yes.
willing to learn more about his situation. And that's a lot. I mean, there's a great lesson in there on customer service for anybody who's working in child support or around child support is you're already dealing with a loaded deck, and not
Yes.
in a good way,
Yeah.
because people don't trust government. And you've got to change them from that distrust to trust. And one way to do that is to listen and to ask questions. So that definitely sticks out. Secondly, suspending someone's driver's license who is a truck driver, probably not a good idea if you want them to make money, right? I mean, there's some common sense elements in there. And third of all, you use data, which from your finance background, it's all about data, right? The numbers tell the story. And all too often, I see people lean on the emotional aspect of what they're trying to prove or disprove, and they forget about data.
Yeah.
A lot of old school folks, they just want to see the numbers. Like, show me what the numbers say, and you did that, which had to be part of the reason why you were successful in those efforts.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I try to keep as much as possible the emotion out of it, because it's that can taint
Yeah,
um our vision sometimes. But if you rely on facts and data to support what you're seeing, so anecdotally, I knew just stories, being in community and hearing the stories. Oftentimes, when I would go and speak in community, I would be bombarded
yeah,
with things like, this is unfair, driver's license and interest charging. That's another that we recently, in the last few years, finally got rid of. But hearing the stories over and over and over and over again, I anecdotally knew it was causing harm, but being able to have the data to support it, and then having demonstration projects that really got at the heart of the matter, and we dug into the data, really, really, really helped us resolve some critical elements here in Minnesota. And it's only continuing to get better because of what we're planning with our Advancing Equity and Child Support grant. And so I look forward to what's going to come out of that, and having the partnerships with the other consortium states, and your state is one of those.
great.
But looking forward to doing some wonderful work that hopefully will impact some of the work that's happening on a national level.
That's awesome. And we mentioned taking the emotions out of something. I'm going to ask you a question that is pretty emotional, and I haven't heard any white men ask this question.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask this question.
Okay.
There's a lot of we talk a lot about DEI in these organizations we're a part of. We talk about DEI a lot in state government as a whole. As a white male, where do I fall into those discussions? I feel a lot of times when that topic is brought up, I kind of just lean back in my chair and I think I'm not going to say anything because one, it's not my place to say anything, and two, I'm probably just going to get in trouble by saying anything. So I tend to be quiet. But the more this is brought up, my question to you is, how can I play an active role in those discussions, and how can I be curious and learn more about that situation?
So I got a story first, and then I'm going to answer that. I'm a
Yeah,
storyteller. You probably know that about me.
I love it.
So my story is, the way that my administration is established now was not by accident. It was intentional, and it was intentionally done by a white man that led as our assistant commissioner. And his goal before retiring was to ensure that we had one of the most diverse, equipped administrations ever, that really represented all citizens across the state of Minnesota, but truly represented the people we serve.
Mhm.
And he serves as a mentor still to this day to many of us. So we have probably to this, and this is no joke, we probably have, if not the most diverse ever, and still, after 10 years, the most diverse senior leadership team across state government in the state of Minnesota, period. So we have, it's myself, our economic assistance director is a woman of color, African American. Our child care assistance director in our administration is a Hmong woman. She was the first, again, African American woman, the first economic assistance. We have now, before it was a white male who identified as gay, but he's no longer in our administration, was our child welfare work director, but now we have African American female. Under those folks, there's directors that identify as Native American, Latin, or South American heritage. So, like the whole leadership team is diverse, right? And that was my intention. And he knew while he was with us that he took a lot of slack for that. And that was back in 2017, 18. But he was like, this is the right thing to do. And he did it. And I can say, I had someone approach me, and I talked about this in another podcast that I did, but I had someone that's not in my immediate division. I was at an event, and we were talking about whole family systems work. And this was a white woman, and she said, and she had been she's been in the department for years, and she's like, this is the first time in many years that, if ever, that the change in the work that's happening here in Minnesota, in particular in children family services, we've seen phenomenal work coming out of our program areas, and our ability to move and really serve people is all because someone intentionally recognized their power and was willing to distribute power to people that usually don't have power in these positions,
right,
and shared that. And now we have the most phenomenal leadership team ever in state government. And I'm like, oh. She's like, you guys are doing phenomenal work. And we could not have done some of that because of you. So, to your question, you have a place in this. I need you, Jay, when there are times when I can't say the things to folks that don't look like me about some of these hard conversations of why disparity and disproportionality are real, and why we need to be intentional, focused on some of these issues, because once we all win when we all win, right?
Yeah.
And as a white man, you sometimes can draw in the voice and the perspective that I cannot as a Black woman.
Right.
So as my friend and my colleague and ally, I'm like, hey, Jay, I'm tapping you in today. I need for you to be able to share the word as well, because they may be more prone to pay attention to what you're saying because you are a white male and man.
Wow.
And what I also say is this conversation is I never want my peers and colleagues to feel bad about this, because a lot of these systems, I work in a system, so I'm a part of the system as a Black woman. I never want my peers and folks to be like, I feel guilty about systemic racism. Don't, because these are systems that were built and founded on principles many years ago. What I want you to do, though, I don't need you to feel guilty about that. What I need for you to do, though, is to be in partnership with folks to say, even though I wasn't a part of that, I recognize it exists, and we want to move forward in making change so that it's for the betterment of everyone. And recognizing that it exists, and everyone says things wrong sometimes, and that's okay. Having conversations about it is just as important.
Yeah.
And so just recognizing that we all have a part to play in this. No one should be sitting on the sidelines saying, oh, everyone should be actively involved. And I'm always open to conversation. So if people are like, well, what should I say or what should I do? You ever want to talk to me and we have a conversation on the side about it? I'm very open to that.
Yeah.
But recognizing these are systems that a lot of us have, we were not a part of the design, but
Right.
we have a responsibility to ensure moving forward that we change those designs to make it better for everyone.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that's you answered that better than I could have imagined. I'm not proud of the fact that I've shied away from those conversations because, in my own organization, I really see the value in diverse opinions. So we build our company in a way that's diverse because there's absolutely value in having people come and sit at a table that have diverse experience and opinions. But when this has been brought up in larger groups, it's a fiery conversation. People get very animated and emotional about it. And I was thinking about asking you this question because I have seen myself just kind of sit back. And I don't really sit back a lot.
You don't.
I usually have an opinion on everything. But that's just one of those areas where I'm like, I don't know what's appropriate. So I think I appreciate your answer. I appreciate your thoughtfulness on that answer. And I think that gives me a lot to think about. It's something I'm studying, something I'm looking into, because if you just watch the news, you're not going to get anything valuable because they've politicized DEI. You see it right?
Absolutely.
Politicized
Absolutely.
And I'm like, ooh, whenever they politicize something, I'm like, well, now I'm definitely not going to talk about it because
we're
all crazy.
Yeah.
Everybody's crazy on both sides. Everybody's crazy.
And that's unfortunate that it has come to this. But think about all of the hard fights in the past that were politicized, that we still had to do the hard work, and we overcame those things.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, leaning away from it and not being curious is not something that's helpful.
Yeah.
And I'm a very curious fella. I mean, you could ask my parents growing up. I was the kid who asked all the questions, and they're like, I'm sure they were at some point like, please just sit down.
I'm pretty sure they were like, oh my God.
And my son is that way now. He's getting he's 3, and he's just now starting to ask all these questions. I'm like, oh. And as a parent, as a parent, one thing I'm worried about is not having an answer to his questions.
Yeah.
Like, you don't, as a parent, you feel like your kids think you know everything, and you want to have an answer to everything.
Yeah. And I'm a grandparent. So I have 2 grandkids. I have a grandson and granddaughter that is my granddaughter just turned 3. And oh boy, I'm like, where did all this? I'm like, and it's not just regular questions, it's philosophical questions.
Yeah.
And I'm like, so kids are a lot, I'll say kids are a lot smarter than we were. Well, I was when I was a kid. But they are really coming into a space of thoughtfulness. And the other important question I will say around this DE&I conversation, kids are seeing a more diverse world than we would have ever, right? And so, they're like my grandson, he has he's in kindergarten. His class is the most, like the kindergarten class is diverse of all aspects you can possibly imagine. And I'm like, this is absolutely phenomenal. So they don't see the differences like we would see as an adult, right? So that's just my buddy, right?
To that point, if we're at a point in society where it's happening naturally, do we muddy the water by talking about it to that generation, it's something I've been curious about is, explaining to my son that, that person in your class has a very different background. They're a different skin color. And this is what all that means. Like, by bringing attention to it, do you take away from the natural progression we're seeing?
To some extent, possibly, but this is me and my grandson. So I have biracial grandchildren. And so I have to have conversations
Mm,
because the world is going to see him and her in a different perspective, right? And so we have the tough conversation at 6 years old. I need you to understand, like my boys, when they were 5 and 6, they understood potentially the harm that the police could cause you as a young Black boy.
yep.
And that's real. But I think talking about it and under having kids, my grandson is a processor, so he'll go and we'll talk about something and he'll come back and be like, okay, well, we talked about this today at school in Black history class because it's important to, so I think it's important for kids to understand the history and the backgrounds of folks and celebrate difference. I
Mm,
think that's the one thing growing up that I wish we would have done more of. Like all of the cultural difference, like that is a celebration because I love it
absolutely.
now. Like
Absolutely.
what all the different months and going to festivals, and especially here in Minnesota, we have a large Native American and Hmong population and Somali population going to the various events and participating in the cultural heritage of those communities is so wonderful and important. So acknowledging cultural difference and then participating and celebrating. And so that's a way of learning, and I have impressed upon that with my grandson, and so he's going to be very, very well-rounded and cultured, and he likes to travel, and so I impress upon him the importance of acknowledging and uplifting the differences in others, while also celebrating yourself as a person.
Yeah, well said. I think it's so. My wife and I talk about this a lot, but um, you know, we're privileged and lucky and blessed to have a family that's close, right? And
Hmm.
my kids are lucky to have both parents around. And instead of just sitting around and saying it's lucky, like take advantage of that. I
Yeah.
mean, if we can, the more kids that we can properly parent to become really good people, the better the world's going to get. And it sounds like you're having the opportunity to do that yet again as a grandparent.
Yeah. Yeah. I get to do it more. Because as a single parent, it was not always the easiest. I had my village around me, but as a grandparent, I see it as um a different journey, and it's a learning journey, and I get to pour into them in a way uniquely than I did with my own kids, and so it's been a lot of fun.
So to wrap things up here, talking about how your grandkids will remember you and also the folks you work with, how they will remember you. What do you want your legacy to be when it's all said and done?
Wow. That is a good question. I think recognizing the hard work, the innovation, the resiliency, um, the willingness to not take no for an answer.
Mm,
This work is challenging on so many levels. Um, Being someone that was willing to advocate um, when it wasn't always easy to advocate. Um, Someone that really is passionate about children, youth, and families and seeing all kids thrive. Um, Living in a state that is very progressive, that we have all of these phenomenal opportunities, but we still have some of the worst racial disparities in the country.
Mm.
And knowing that every single day, myself and my colleagues in our state are really advocating for children, so that regardless of race and zip code, every child is thriving, um, and living to that, being very actionable and intentional in the work. Those are the things I think about when I think about my legacy, um, and the folks that I've brought along in this journey.
That's a great answer, and I think you're well on your way. I mean, we've been in the same room together many a times, and you're an influential person. When you speak, people listen, and that's a powerful that's a powerful position to be in, because what you say does matter.
Hmm.
Um, and I appreciate you joining us today. I appreciate you diving into the hard topics that I wish people would talk more about. And I appreciate you inspiring me to be curious and learn more about some areas where I think I can learn more.
Yeah. Thank you. And I thank you for the kind words. Look, hey, I'll take them, Jay. And I mean it. If you ever want to do some hard dialogue and conversation, I'm your person. So I got you, friend.
Thank you so much.